Buenas tardes. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar today, Disasters in Puerto Rico and the Impact of the Diaspora. Today, we have a great lineup. Two of our best researchers, Carlos Vargas and Jennifer Hinojosa, will be presenting their work. Jennifer will be talking about enduring disasters, Puerto Rico 3 years after Maria. That report was just uploaded today. You can download it. Carlos is going to be talking about a report that he did with Charles Venator about Holyoke. Holyoke is one case study of how displacement and migration play out in the age of climate change. Those presentations will be followed by some commentary from Sandra Rodriguez Cotto, an award-winning journalist, talk radio host, and analyst. She's a veteran of Centro events. She has participated in many panels with the Puerto Ricans series. And Dr. Fernando Rivera, who's a professor at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. And he's also the director of the Puerto Rico Research Hub at the University of Central Florida. What I would like to do now is give you a brief introduction to where we are in regard to Puerto Rico's economic recovery. How is it proceeding? And to do that, I have four questions that I will answer very succinctly. The first one is, what is the economic impact of the disaster? The second one is, what is the status of federal spending to mitigate the disaster and support economic recovery? The third question is, what is the local participation in federal disaster recovery programs? Somewhat of an ongoing debate in Puerto Rico that I think is important to address. And finally, what are the indicators of recovery and how this presentation relates to the next presentation by our speakers. So in this graphic that shows the Puerto Rico Economic Activity Index from 1980 to the present, you can see the relationship between federal policies and sort of an injection of funding in various times, throughout the post-war history. So we start in 1980, and you can see that it's an index based on whatever the GDP was at that time. And what you can see, though, is that there is a period that we come out of a recession. This is when Section 936 was enacted. And then we start climbing as the federal tax credits, impact the economy, economic activity, up to the point where Section 936 is phased out in 1996. And you can start seeing that there's a little bit of a slowdown up to the point where 936 are completely phased out in 2005, and then the economy begins this steep decline. The next policy that was significant for Puerto Rico economic recovery was the ARA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, that was a response to the financial crisis. And you can see that in these following years, 2010, 2011, 2012, the economy recovered a little bit until the funding expired, and then we start going back again in decline, economic decline. That was disrupted by Hurricanes Irma and Maria. And you can see a drop in the gross domestic product, a significant drop that brought the economy pretty much at the same level that it was in 1980. That is the impact of Hurricanes Irma and Maria on the economy, a devastating impact. The economy starts recovering, and you see a little bit of an uptick in the following period in 2019, yet to be followed in 2020 by both the earthquakes and the pandemic that are also pulling down the economy. So it's a significant impact on the economy. The disasters have really aggravated the long-term decline of the Puerto Rico economy. In this graphic showing the rate of growth of GDP, is a measure of how healthy the economy is. That story about the long-term trend can be seen exactly in terms of the growth of the GDP. And as you can see, at the end of 2017, with the impact of Maria, the economy started into a recession, and it deepened in 2018 with a recovery in 2019, and then back to a downfall of about 6% of GDP now with the pandemic and everything else. And economists project that there will be an uptick next year, but that remains to be seen. Those are projections. Now, the important thing, and what I'm trying to illustrate here, is how federal funding has been critical to the economy of Puerto Rico. Everybody knows that. But let's see how exactly federal funding for disaster recovery and economic recovery is unfolding. So in this graphic, I present from the FEMA Spending Explorer website, which actually summarizes all the disaster financial aid to Puerto Rico into some very graphic summary of what's going on. And you can see that there are three different types of accounting that you need to keep in mind. The first one is what is allocated. This is what Congress appropriates for Puerto Rico. That goes to the executive, and the executive from that account will assign to the various agencies, according to what Congress legislated, an amount of funding that will be spent when they're satisfied that the local jurisdictions are implementing the policies as they see fit. And then the final column shows you the outlay, the expenditures, the actual payments that have been done from those accounts to the local actors that are implementing the recovery programs, right? So what you can see when we start dissecting those numbers is that of the 46 billions, the big two sort of entries into what Congress appropriated are 20 billion for Community Development Fund, which goes to Vivienda in Puerto Rico, Department of Housing in Puerto Rico, and another 17 billion assigned to FEMA. Everything else pales in comparison. Those are the big two appropriations for disaster recovery. When you see how much of that has been obligated, of the 25 billion, 17 billions went to disaster relief fund to FEMA, okay? And that goes to pay for public assistance, basically anything that has to do with sustaining the population, cleanup, water, health, any that goes in direct assistance to the emergency phase of the recovery. And then you see that HUD received $3.2 billion in terms of obligation from the executive. Part of that has been spent. But when you look at the last slide, in terms of the money that has actually been spent, you see that the big chunk of funding spent corresponds to the FEMA Disaster Relief Fund, the one that goes to the emergency phase of this. And CDBG-DR disappears, or CDBG, the development fund from HUD disappeared from the picture. Why? Because only 96 million of the almost $20 billion in that fund have been actually disbursed as expenses in Puerto Rico, and a good portion of that has to do with administration of the various programs that they are trying to implement. So the delay in approval from the executive is a real impediment to the economic recovery, to the extent that the local agencies cannot begin programs and spending in programs, unless those fundings are released to the local jurisdiction. That's a very important point to keep. The other point that I like to make is how is that funding impacting the local actors, right? So here I present the main program that has been instituted to date with respect to housing. This is a program that is for repair, reconstruction, and relocation, so-called the R3 program. This program allocated about $700 billion for that purpose, right? The punchline here is that 70% of that allocation was allocated to foreign corporations that are registered outside of Puerto Rico, and about 30%, mostly private sector all private sector, but mostly construction companies that have adapted their operations to respond to this program. And those are domestic. About 30% of the management of that program was allocated to them. However, 27,000 people applied for this program, and up to date, only about 45 homes have started rehabilitation or rebuilding. And of those, no one yet has finished that process. So it's all this to say that between the appropriation to the program implementation to the actual getting results on the ground is a long period of time. So therefore, Puerto Rico is sort of affected by various processes, including the local capacity. I will then present an example of how the low-income housing tax credit, back with the ARA funds, remember, in response to the financial crisis, 2009, 10, 11, 12. And what you can see in this graphic is that when the nonprofit sector was involved, there was a much rapid response in the disbursement of those funds, to a point where the nonprofit sector actually built more housing using those funds, rehabilitated or constructed new housing using these funds that were specially allocated by ARA, than the private sector in 2009, 2010, and I believe that was under a new Progressive Party administration. So let me just summarize by saying that we have seen a couple of indicators of recovery, right? One, obviously, is the gross domestic product. The other one is the federal funding that flows from disaster appropriations to Puerto Rico. But we have to look at two more indicators, and that's what we're going to do next. One of them is migration, and the other one is assessing whether population is returning to the affected areas, to the disaster areas. And we're going to look at how whatever happens in Puerto Rico, the migration from the island is actually affecting the diaspora, okay? We're going to use Holyoke as a case study. Carlos Vargas is going to talk about that. And we're going to start teasing out the correlation between disaster and climate change migration. I want to end my remarks by saying that we have a couple more webinars in the making. We have several more activities during the semester, but the next two webinars, where we will have panels and experts presenting data and discussing the situation, will be one on the impact of COVID on stateside Puerto Rican communities, and another teasing out this issue of civic capacity in Puerto Rico for economic recovery. So let me now turn to the presenters. We will start with Jennifer Hinojosa.
Thank you everyone for attending our webinar. I'll do a very quick presentation of the Puerto Rican population in the US and in Puerto Rico 3 years after Hurricane Maria. I'll be presenting on post-Hurricane Maria, Exodus 3 years after. And in any case, all of the graphics and tables that are in this presentation can also be found in the pamphlet. The post-Hurricane Maria Exodus represents one of the most significant movements of the Puerto Ricans to the US mainland in the island's history in terms of both volume and duration. So there was a massive out-migration in a very short period of time. The 2019 ACS one-year estimate was released last week, and what we found most significant about that data set was that the migration numbers were lower than pre-Hurricane Maria levels. So for example, the 2019 ACS reported a total of 66,000 residents that relocated to the US mainland, and about 31,000 returned back to Puerto Rico. So that gave us a net migration of about 34,800. And if we compare that to the 2018 ACS, the year after Hurricane Maria made landfall on the island, 133,451 residents left the island, and 20,900 returned back to the island. So that gave us a net migration of 112,000. So that's a very huge difference between 2018 to 2019. Here's a table of the US population by major ethnic groups between 2017 to 2019. What I want to focus on is on the Puerto Rican population in the U.S. So if we look at 2017, the Puerto Rican population was about 5.5 million in 2017. And 1 year later, since Maria made landfall, that has increased to 5.7 million in 2018. And if we fast forward to 2019, that has further increased to 5.8 million. So we can clearly see that Hurricane Maria had a huge impact in the growth of the Puerto Rican population in the U.S. And if we look at the Puerto Rico's population, it was the opposite, where we did see a decline because of Hurricane Maria. And that could be attributed to the outmigration and even deaths as well. So if we look at 2017, Puerto Rico's population was at 3.3 million, and then has drastically declined in 2018 to 3.1 million, and has slightly declined to 3.1 million in 2019. So we could see here that if we look at the change between 2018 to 2019, it hasn't changed too much. But again, Hurricane Maria really did have a huge impact in both Puerto Ricans in the US and on the island. In this graphic here, we get a nice bird's eye view of the migration flows from Puerto Rico to the US between 1941 to 2019. And here we have 3 different indicators. We have the population balance equation represented in red, the American Community Survey, and the net movement of passengers, which is data from the Department of Transportation statistics. And as we can see here in the graphic, during this time period, we saw more of an outmigration flow here, and this represents the Great Migration period. And then if we fast forward during the economic crisis, you know, all 3 indicators do sort of tell a similar narrative. And if we look at here during the economic crisis period, we do see more of an outflow than inflow. And if we look at during Hurricane Maria 2017, we do see a huge increase in terms of outmigration, and represented across all 3 indicators, but the net movement of passengers really does show the volume of migration, of outmigration here. But in 2018 and 2019, interestingly enough, we tend to see more of a return migration happening. So this is very interesting, and we discussed that a bit more in the pamphlet. In this graphic, we look at Puerto Rican population in Puerto Rico and in the US. So it's a very telling graphic in terms of the growth of the Puerto Rican population over time, and the decline of the Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico over time as well. So Puerto Rico's population continues to decline, even slightly, while the Puerto Ricans in the US continue to grow. And we did see that gap widen between post-Hurricane Maria. Since Hurricane Maria struck the island, there was a massive out-migration in a very short period of time. But it's very clear in this graphic that the long-term migration trends are expected to continue the trajectory of the economic crisis period. The impacts of stateside Puerto Rican communities. So we see here, we look at 2018 and 2019 and the top 10 states. So this should be no surprise. Florida continues to be the state with the largest Puerto Rican population, followed by New York and Pennsylvania, New Jersey. But what I want to sort of get out of this table in terms of gains between 2018 and 2019, New York was the state with the most population gains, Puerto Rican population gains. So it has gained about 26,700 Puerto Ricans. Texas is another state that has gained population, Puerto Rican population, of about 24,000, followed by Pennsylvania, 15,000, and Massachusetts, 11,000. In terms of modest gains or growth, Connecticut, Florida, and Illinois tend to hold that spot. This is very interesting. New Jersey was the state with the largest loss of Puerto Rican population between 2018 and 2019. and that loss was about 32,566. And this last table we have here, this is the migration from Puerto Rico to the top 10 states. So as we saw in the first slide, there were about 66,000 residents that left the island to the US mainland, and the majority of them relocated in Florida, Texas, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. So just some concluding remarks here. So with the 2019 data, it does suggest that Hurricane Maria exodus is slowing down. Long-term migration trends are expected to continue the trajectory of the economic crisis period. Stateside Puerto Ricans showed the largest decline in New Jersey between 2018 to 2019. New York and Texas showed the largest gains of the Puerto Rican population in that same 1 year span. And we're gonna have to wait for the 2020 data to give us an idea of certain whether the earthquakes or the pandemics are inducing further depopulation of the island. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at jhinojos@hunter.cuny.edu. Thank you.
So one question is, if you have numbers prior to migration and migration prior to to Maria, the actual numbers, and also after Maria, if you can speak about what happened in terms of numbers, right? And the other question is, what has been the impact of COVID on migration? So I'm going to leave those two. There are a couple more that are more discussion based that I will leave for afterwards.
Okay. Thank you very much. The numbers prior to Hurricane Maria, we call them the economic crisis numbers in terms of migration. I'm trying to look for this graphic that we always push out, and we always update it to look at the return migration and out migration. But I want to say the numbers are, I believe they were not as high as that they are right now, but they were we were looking at numbers between the 30,000s, 50,000s during pre-Hurricane Maria in terms of the out migration. Obviously, we saw in the presentation when Hurricane Maria hit, that number went as high up as 233,000. So there's a huge difference day and night. But what we're seeing now is that the out migration, we're returning back to what it was pre-Hurricane Maria levels. And I believe the second question related to the COVID question. So can you repeat that question? Sorry, Edwin.
Well, the other one was in regard to COVID and what do you estimate to be the impact of that?
So that's going to be very difficult to estimate because, as we all know, we are all trying to estimate the impact of migration post-Hurricane Maria. And I think we're just going to have to wait for the 2020 census to come out to really see the impact of the COVID. I know that we have the other researchers are using the Department of Transportation's statistic, the net movement of passengers. So that'll be a great way to measure that because we have, I believe, monthly data. So that would be a way to sort of to look into that. But in regards to census, it might be a bit difficult. Edwin, I don't know if you want to chime in on this.
Well, the other question that is surfacing here is whether the migration that went to the stateside, right? The people that left the island actually returned to Puerto Rico. In other words, when you compare the two flows, what is the proportionality, right, between the two flows? What is the net migration in the last couple of years that you can speak whether all the people that left actually are returning to Puerto Rico?
Right. So what we saw with the 2019 data, I believe, was about 20,900 residents that returned back to Puerto Rico. So that one, what we're seeing is a bit of an uptick of return migration when we compare that to the 2018 data. So the net migration, I believe, I discussed that in the first slide. I believe it was like a net migration of 34,000, and when you for 2019, and if you compare that to the 2018 ACS that was 1 year post Hurricane Maria, it was 112,000. So that's a large gap between 2018 and 2019. So we are seeing a bit of a return migration, but it's not enough to level off, you know, to say that it was an immense migration. People are heading back to Puerto Rico. So, and I believe Census released an article related to the effect of a return migration happening that we have not seen in many decades. So if you look at that graphic where it shows the historical net migration between 1941 to 2019, you see that uptick of a return migration. But in my 2 cents, I don't think it's enough to say, oh, there's a huge migration flow back to Puerto Rico that really balanced out people leaving Puerto Rico, if that makes any sense. So I think my suggestion is that we're going to have to wait till the 2020 census does come out and, you know, look into different I know there's different methodologies to look into migration using cell phone data, et cetera. And I believe we discussed that in the 2-year anniversary pamphlet that we released a year ago. So we're just going to have to wait and see. Is there a return migration? Yes, there's an uptick, but it's not as drastic as, you know, what.
But I think the salient point in what you're referring to is that this last year, compared to even prior to Maria, has been a lower number than
Right.
what it was during the economic crisis. So there is a phenomenon there that we need to study. But I like to thank you, Jennifer. We can discuss this more after we make all the presentations, but I'd like to move to the next presentation. And we have Dr. Carlos Vargas with us, and he's going to be, you know, presenting for 8-10 minutes. And you have the PowerPoint, Carlos, right?
Yes, I do. Buenas tardes, damas y caballeros. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the opportunity to present some findings from anticipated vulnerabilities, displacement, and migration in the age of climate change. These are lessons from the Hollyoaks, the city of Hollyoaks response to Hurricane Maria for the Massachusetts Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. The effects of Hurricane Maria are still being felt in Puerto Rico as well as in Puerto Rican communities throughout the United States, 3 years after the storm devastated the island. So while Puerto Rico bore the overwhelming brunt of the cyclone, its impact was also felt in places in the United States in which Puerto Ricans have settled. With the increased mobility of people across countries, however, the effects of temporales are felt not only in the communities they directly hit, but also in communities to which residents of those communities turn to seek help. Hurricane Maria is an example of how a weather event that takes place in the Caribbean affects communities not just there, but also far and away. One such place was Holyoke in Western Massachusetts, 1,000 miles away from the Caribbean. The experiences of those displaced to the United States by the hurricane, as well as the relatives who provided them with safe haven in the United States, in addition to the civic and governmental sector that supported both the groups of the displaced and the group of the hosts, are gathered, and they did so in the weeks, months, and now years after the storm hit, are collected in, as I said, this report, Anticipated Vulnerabilities, which is a joint effort. It's a joint effort by the Center for Puerto Rican Studies and the Institute of Latino, Latin American, and Caribbean Studies of the University of Connecticut Stores. And my co-author is Charles Venator Santiago, a political scientist from that institution. Let me just say that, as Jennifer just related, one of the effects of the hurricane was a massive emigration from Puerto Rico. I could say that, you know, the 3 months following Maria's landfall saw an exodus of people from the island, and I will not, you know, tread over that terrain since, you know, Jennifer did a wonderful job on outlining that. I will say that participants in the Holyoke study confirmed the estimates with the bulk of persons displaced by the hurricane arriving in Western Massachusetts between October and December 2017, with a noticeable increase in returns to the island starting in January 2018. But among the most noticeable and relevant findings of the report, I will tell you that the top 3 reasons, as you can imagine, the top 3 reasons, as you can imagine, for leaving Puerto Rico for Holyoke were damage on uninhabitable homes, the lack of steady income or employment, and lack of food. People were actually hungry as one of the reasons why they were forced to leave the island. And this chart presents a few of the other reasons that people mention as, forcing them to leave the island. The majority of people displaced from the island and arriving in Holyoke, they relied on key networks, and that is friends and families who provided them with support in addressing their needs. One point that I like to underscore here is that given the socioeconomic standings of Puerto Ricans that resided in Holyoke, I will say that the brunt of the burden of giving refuge, hosting these persons displaced from Puerto Rico were working class Puerto Ricans and Puerto Ricans living in poverty. And I will remark even further that one of the characteristics of the Holyoke is that it is a community with the largest concentrations of Puerto Ricans in the United States. Nearly half the population of Holyoke is Puerto Rican. And not only that, it is also a community with great economic need, given by the fact that Puerto Ricans in New England generally, and in Massachusetts specifically, have the highest rates of poverty and the lowest rates of household income in the entire country. So of all Puerto Ricans in the United States, those located and settled in Massachusetts tend to be the worst off socioeconomically. Yet, in spite of the great economic disadvantages, the Puerto Rican community in Holyoke rallied to respond first by providing material assistance to friends, family, and the entire communities in Puerto Rico, and then by opening their homes to relatives and friends that were displaced in the aftermath of the storm. So these key networks, friends and family that were in Massachusetts, as well as all over the United States, but the focus here is on Massachusetts, were the first line of defense once Puerto Ricans arrived in the United States. And as you can see here in this chart, who did you relate the most to address the needs that you had upon arriving in the United States? Certainly 38%, the bulk of respondents mentioned relatives and friends, followed by doing it on their own. People were making it out on their own. So about 50%, more than 50%, 60% almost, of people who were displaced by the storm and ended up in Massachusetts, had to rely on their own resources or resources of their key networks. Resources from the government, etc., were not as prominent, although still, not trivial either. The various levels of government encouraged Puerto Ricans to leave the island and travel to cities in Holyoke. So we encountered respondents who told us that the mayor of the town in Puerto Rico told them to leave, that people from FEMA told them to get on the plane and go and seek aid in the United States. And organizations such as the Red Cross also encouraged some people to leave the island. And many people made the decision. Most of the people who left Puerto Rico left because they made the decision to leave Puerto Rico. It's a circumscribed decision because they were forced to, they were compelled to by economic circumstances, by life and death circumstances, and many left because they thought that they would find resources in the United States, or because the United States would provide them with more economic opportunities such as work, housing, healthcare, etc. Displaced Puerto Ricans resided in Holyoke and in Western Massachusetts view the city of Holyoke as a resource. So Holyoke was a resource precisely because it had a high concentration of Puerto Ricans, because there were many Puerto Ricans in the town that provided a level of assistance to these displaced Puerto Ricans. The federal government's response to the disaster was essentially inadequate and at times exacerbated and created new crises for Puerto Ricans in the United States and for Puerto Rican communities in the United States and for communities in which Puerto Ricans in the United States live, for the government of those communities. And a fundamental failure in the response to the crisis was the lack of adequate information and data sharing about the needs of displaced migrating Puerto Ricans. The federal government oftentimes refused to share substantive information about the needs of displaced Puerto Ricans with local entities. So you had FEMA engaging in case management in Massachusetts and holding on to the information, not sharing it with the local social service agencies or the local town or the county government that were also providing some level of assistance. So, they might have been working, if not at cross purposes, certainly in the least efficient way possible. In Puerto Rico, in the aftermath of the storm, local governments, the municipal governments were the first line of response to the disaster, but the ability of municipal governments in Puerto Rico to coordinate beyond those municipalities, beyond their jurisdiction, was fairly limited, admired by the lack of capacity, lack of efficacy, corruption, preparation, and lack of resources. So they were relying on local resources to attend to the crisis, but they were insufficient once those municipalities had to attend to issues beyond their jurisdiction because it was not their jurisdiction, out of jurisdiction. Communal solidarity, was a key dimension in the positive response to the disaster in Puerto Rico and in the city of Holyoke. So the sense among Puerto Ricans, both in Puerto Rico, but specifically in Holyoke, that we had to take care of our own, that we had to take care of our people, was a great asset that Puerto Ricans had in responding to the crisis. So this sense of solidarity was a resource that could be tapped for future resources. However, there are limits to what that communal solidarity, to what that sense of solidarity can provide. It does not make up for a lack of material resources. It is something that you can tap on. This sense of solidarity, it is something that you must tap on and rely on to provide assistance, but it cannot make up for lack of material resources. And that is something that became very evident in Holyoke. The civic sector, whether civic organizations, religious organizations, secular organizations, provided substantive but limited support to Puerto Ricans in the island as well as the United States. So the civic sector became a very important component providing assistance for people in Puerto Rico and in Puerto Rican communities in the United States. The biggest need by far that displaced Puerto Ricans encounter was affordable and accessible housing. As we can see here, the chart presents us with the most important needs that Puerto Ricans that travel to the Western Massachusetts area encounter. So we see housing, 44% of Puerto Ricans encounter housing as the biggest issue. Unemployment was also very high up. Access to medical care and not enough income for one's family, were pretty significant also as a need when they came to Massachusetts. Once accessible or access to affordable housing was achieved, that tended to stabilize displaced families. So once people who migrated as a result of the hurricane, they were able to find housing, they were able to stabilize many other aspects of their life, whether it was finding a job, actually getting to school, access to healthcare, etc. And many, even though many of the respondents said that they relied on key networks, on their friends and family to tend to their needs in Massachusetts, there is no question about the fact that many also relied on civic organizations, governmental agencies, churches, etc., and they found them to be fairly useful in tending to their needs. So the reliance on an existing stock of resources, not just at the individual or family level, but at the community level, is also very important to tend to the needs of people displaced by catastrophes such as the ones that we encounter with Hurricane Maria. However, you know, even though you may have had this stock of resources available, you know, respondents, when they're seeking aid, they cannot make the distinction between the federal government, the state government, the city government, particularly if they're coming from Puerto Rico, and they cannot distinguish whether a city is a city agency or a state agency. Yes, they may know FEMA, they may know Social Security, but beyond that, they may not know whether an agency is even a governmental agency. They may not know whether the local social service agency is non-governmental, but rather private, but with a contract from the state perhaps to provide assistance. Ultimately, the majority of people in displaced by the hurricanes that relied on governmental services found the assistance provided by the government of Massachusetts and the city of Holyoke very useful. Social service agencies were an important lifeline for, you know, tending to the needs. What is interesting is that, again, because the Puerto Rican population in Massachusetts tend to be not very well off, and the people displaced by the hurricane tended to be the most vulnerable initially prior to the storm, and that vulnerability translated itself in great need. When they traveled from Puerto Rico to Holyoke, many of those Puerto Ricans who traveled from the island seeking refuge to Holyoke encountered conditions for the Puerto Rican community in Holyoke, which were also pretty dire. So they got compounded. And many of the needs that displaced Puerto Ricans encounter once they arrived in Massachusetts came to be fairly similar to the ones that Puerto Ricans in Massachusetts who were there prior to the storm already encountered. Many of them were also, for instance, not enough food for their families, not enough income for their families, the rent being too high. I must point out to the fact that housing in Holyoke, Massachusetts is very tight. It's a very tight rental market. Therefore, people who resided in Holyoke prior to the storm were themselves encountering very tough housing conditions. What was successful in light of all of these conditions was the creation of a central place or resource center that provided access to the various federal agencies, local agencies, and resources for an extended period of time under the umbrella of one-stop shopping. There was a family resource center in Holyoke that became the hub of service provision in Western Massachusetts. And that did not make things easy, but it made things certainly easier because it concentrated information, resources, and know-how to an extent that would not have existed that did not exist in other places in Western Massachusetts. Among the providers of assistance, regular meetings was very important in coordinating the delivery of services. And finally, the sense of solidarity that existed not just within the Puerto Rican community, but within the civic sector and the governmental sector in Holyoke became very important. It facilitated the workings among themselves in time of high strain, high demand for their services. So standing patterns of cooperation, coordination, and communication made it better, not good, but better under very dire circumstances. However, they all faced insufficient resources before and during the response to the crisis presented by people displaced by the hurricane, which hamper an effective response. And to conclude, you know, the example or the lessons that Holyoke presented can present to the world is the need for preparation and anticipation at the municipal level, since the municipal level is the one that tends to respond for better or for worse, fairly or unfairly. Municipal levels are the ones that oftentimes bear the brunt of the need to respond to this humanitarian crisis. And with that, I'll conclude my presentation.
Thank you so much, Carlos. This was a great presentation. Many of the questions that that are related to your presentation. You sort of answered, but let me first, congratulate you and Charles Venator for completing what I think is a good example of how localities, best practice of how municipalities and local agencies can respond to people that migrate to that area as a response to the disaster, in particular in Puerto Rico. So this the best practice of community level, which is to create this hub of services, goes to some of the questions that people are asking. For example, there were three questions that are directly related to the housing issue. One of them is, first, what about shelters? Are there still people in that situation where they haven't found housing, and what is the role of the state and the local government and the agencies and so forth? The second one is related to the fact that in many areas they don't know what Puerto Ricans are, and they treat them as foreign, or you have your green card, and what that does is create barriers for access to programs, right? So you alluded a little bit to that, but if you can clarify that. And the other, obviously, the cost of real estate in the area, you also alluded to that. But those were the questions that I think are related a little bit to the factual part of your presentation.
Certainly, as I mentioned before, the housing market in Western Massachusetts, but in Holyoke in particular, is very tight. There is a very low vacancy rate even before the hurricane, right? And even though Holyoke, Massachusetts, in and of itself, is not a booming city, meaning it has gone through a lot of the deindustrialization that the entire Northeast and Midwest has gone through. So it is a city that now is beginning to gain in population, but that is also creating pressures on the existing housing stock, which also, because it tends to be pretty old, is not in the best condition. So, it tends to be limited, it tends to be old and in need of repairs, and nevertheless, rents are very high. And this is something that Puerto Ricans who lived there before the hurricane encounter. So imagine how things got compounded once displaced families arrived in Holyoke. Many families that came from the island ended up staying with other family members. So yes, there were many hotels, not necessarily shelters. FEMA made use of existing hotels in the Hampden County area to house folks that were displaced by the storm in Puerto Rico. But that was temporary. It is a temporary shelter assistance program. And after a period of 3 months initially, and then 6 months, and almost nearly a year, that assistance ended. Over time, at least by the vast majority of people that we either interview or conducted focus groups with, they had stabilized their housing situation, either because they found an apartment on their own, or they were able to live with family members for an extended period of time. So are there people still in shelters? There may still be a few people that are somehow relying on temporary shelter assistance, but the program pretty much ended after a year after the storm. And I think that there was a third point, which I forget now.
Well, the whole question of the access to the programs and the role of the hub.
Oh, no. I mean, the role of the hub was like one of the, we also conducted focus groups with social service organizations and the civic sector in Holyoke. And one of the participants thought that it was a brilliant idea to have everything under one roof, which, by the way, it was also replicated in Puerto Rico. There were municipalities that en la cancha de recreo, they actually brought together all the services that a municipality could provide, and also bring in the assistance from either the Red Cross or FEMA or what have you. So creating a hub where you can concentrate resources, and I'm talking about material resources, and I'm talking about know-how, and I'm talking about perhaps coordination among themselves, facilitated greatly the provision of services for families in need. That is possibly one of the biggest takeaways from the report.
So I have a couple of questions that are more discussion. We're gonna go now to Fernando Rivera's presentation, but think about these two questions. One of them is what are the motivations for people to go back to Puerto Rico after everything that was provided for them in Holyoke, right? And whether that cost of housing was one of the factors that influenced that. And obviously the other question is whether this best practice is replicable. This is not going to be the last disaster. You know, we right now, we should expect a COVID, post-COVID migration. It's just that people cannot travel now, but the unemployment has spiked, as we know. The economy is weakened even more, so we should expect that. So think about those two pieces, are more discussion. And I would like you to go now to Professor Fernando Rivera's presentation, and then we'll take more discussion questions at the end.
Thank you for having me. Delighted to be here in this webinar. I want to take the opportunity first, maybe some of you are not familiar with the Puerto Rico Research Hub at the University of Central Florida. And basically our purpose is to investigate, disseminate knowledge, and provide creative solutions to pressing needs affecting the Puerto Rican community, is the diaspora and surrounding communities. And you can find more information there on the website listed. Four of the main things that we do is academic research. We provide opportunities for students to do research. We also do these outreach opportunities. So what we learn, we want to share with the community, not only the academic community, but also the community at large. And we're big on partnerships. And this is an example of the great partnership that the Puerto Rico Research Hub has with El Centro. So getting into the reports and the findings that we discussed today, and I wanted to take the chance to compare some of the things that happen in Holyoke and compare it to Florida, and some main topics out here in terms of some of the things that were going on. So if you look closely at the report in terms of the response to the storm, you know, and basically when the storm did happen, what was the response? Basically in Puerto Rico, before families actually moved to the continental United States. As you can see, it seems that government was relatively absent, and it was a realization that a lot of people had to depend on each other. And we have, you know, sort of a study that Ariana Valle did on families that came here to Central Florida. You see some of the similarities in terms of the experience of the response. So you see some similar patterns out here. When we look at the reasons for moving and the ones that Carlos showed out there or are in the report, it tells you obviously in the Holyoke case that there was a lot of mass destruction, that people didn't have much choice. But if we see some of the studies from Florida International University and the study that Gamarra did after in the summer of 2018, it shows that, you know, financial opportunities were high on that, and some reflect some of the similarities as well with the report. One of the things also in looking at the report and the recommendations, right? Sort of this one-stop shop place where people could actually consolidate all the resources that were available in the community. In the case of Holyoke, you had Enlace de Familias, kind of like became that center out here. Here in Central Florida, we had sort of a multiple agency resource center at the airport that provided sort of all the resources right there at the airport where people could take advantage of those. It ran from somewhere to October to December. The majority of the cases were in October when we had that large influx of people coming in. One of the big differences out here, this is a community in Holyoke. You have a community center that is established, continues on. The issue that we have here in Florida is that, you know, that center was eventually dissolved. And basically the responsibility for the follow-up, all those sort of things landed on those nonprofit organizations, some governmental agencies out here. But again, sort of some similarities in terms of that. One of the big issues also in terms of the report on Holyoke is the issue of climate migration, right? That right now we have kind of like this idea that it's only Puerto Rico, but that eventually we see sort of the impact of climate change and different scenarios that we have right now. We have the fires in California, we've seen floods, we've seen the hurricanes, all those type of things. And that's given me and giving the academic community another avenue to do research upon. So I want to share quickly with the audience some of the research that we're doing. And so we're part of a team of scholars that we're looking at climate migrant receiving communities in the Gulf area. And this is part of the National Academy of Sciences Gulf Research Program. And we're collaborating out here. But we're looking at comparing out here. And the point is that it's not only Puerto Rico that is going through this, that is impacting the diaspora, but we've seen that internally as well. So looking at what happened in Hurricane Katrina and how Houston responded to it, what's happening in Louisiana right now in terms of sub-communities dealing with climate change, and obviously in the Orlando site, the site we're responsible for, how did their community in Orlando responded to that as well. And we're doing it through 5 main areas, basically looking at housing markets, we're looking at financial services that include literacy and debt counseling, employment and economic development opportunities, healthcare provided capacity, and social, cultural, and recreational activities. So we are underway with that study, and we'll look forward to share those results in the future. Looking at the other report and the other presentation, Disasters in Puerto Rico and the Impact on the Diaspora. It's been 3 years after Hurricane Maria, and now we have a little bit of information. I was fortunate enough to serve as guest editor for a special edition of Population and Environment, which you can see on your screen, and I recommend that you actually access that because it has a lot of information. But in this, it gave us sort of a chance to see what were those population changes, what are some of the techniques that we can use in terms of that. There was a lot of confusion at the beginning. Do we use just census? Do we use airport transportation data? Do we use school records? So now we see a little bit of clarity out here in terms of those. So we have a wonderful collection of scholars that are paying attention to those issues. I'm providing some of the things. Still 3 years out, there's still things that we are just beginning to understand out here. And I think the work that Centro doing is important in providing some answers to those questions that we still have. We had kind of like this issue of cascading disasters, right? Not only Hurricane Maria, but we also, at the beginning of this year, we had the earthquakes. And also, we're dealing with the pandemic, we're dealing with COVID-19 right now. So what is going to be sort of the impact of that as well in terms of that? What has been the impact on the diaspora in terms of that? Ironically enough, the response to Hurricane Maria, the response to the earthquakes has all of a sudden become a spotlight in our presidential campaign out here. So we have both candidates putting together platforms of how to address these issues out here. So basically a big impact here locally on the continental United States in terms of looking what is the impact of, 3 years after Maria, we're still talking about these issues. Recently, with these numbers out here, and you can see we have seen, especially in the Central Florida area, that a lot of Puerto Ricans did actually return. So kind of like this idea that, how are we going to deal with this temporal kind of like movements and permanent type of movements, whether they're going to remain in one place on another is going to be an issue that we need to study. And, kind of like this issue of climate migration is going to continue to happen, right? In terms of, the displacement of people continue to happen, and Puerto Ricans are part of that equation as well. Obviously, COVID-19 is going to have a profound impact as well. And we know so far that it has affected Puerto Ricans in areas that we have high concentration. So places like New York, New Jersey, Florida. And basically, how have we still, we've seen that it has impacted, issues such as employment, housing, healthcare, and insurance. So those are issues that we continue to look at in the future. I wish I had a crystal ball to tell you what's going to happen, but from the evidence that we have, we are 3 years and we're still talking about reconstruction. We're still talking about dispensing funds. We're still talking about these issues. So we knew from the beginning this was going to be a long process, and it's going to continue to be a long process out here in terms of that. But some of the lessons that we learned is that community groups, nonprofit groups, have been the ones that have taken the lead in responding to this, right? Both in Puerto Rico and both here in the diaspora. So it's time to recognize, how do we give them the resources out here to make sure that they're successful? I think one of the good things about all this spotlight that Puerto Rico has is that it's going to provide us with some type of accountability as well. I think it's time to make our decision makers accountable for their decisions in terms of all the disaster, in terms of the recovery, in terms of the things that are working and the things that are not working. Obviously, that depends on us and on Puerto Ricans exercising our potential political power. We have a great opportunity to make a difference, but we have to make sure not only to register to vote, but to go out there and exercise our right to vote. And finally, we need to remain vigilant to emergency situations. If 2020 has provided us with any indication of what the future is going to look like, we can not only concentrate on hurricanes. And sort of the case of Puerto Rico has shown us that it's hurricanes, it's droughts, it's earthquakes, it's COVID-19. The same here, same thing here, stateside, right? It seems that, depending on the time of the day, we have this shift in temperatures, we have floods, we have sea level rise, we have hurricanes, we have tornadoes, we have a lot of things going on. So we need to remain vigilant out there. But I think this is a great opportunity for both the community in the diaspora and the community in Puerto Rico to come together, and there's no alternative. We'll continue to work hard to make sure that Puerto Rico continues its path to a full recovery.
So thank you, Fernando. Very interesting presentation. There were a couple of questions that surfaced while you were speaking. One of them is related to the return migration. So in your estimation, what is the balance of the population? We know from the data from 2019 that it was a washout, that there were that return migration to Central Florida and other parts of Florida kind of was equivalent to the people that left. So there's a huge return migration. And, can you expand on that? And then what were the factors in your estimation? Some people asked whether racism played a role. Other people were referring to what you just spoke about, the housing and the whole question of jobs, right? And what's going. So if you can answer that, then we can move to Sandra.
Yeah, no, so similar to the numbers that Jennifer was providing us, there was a stabilization out here. And we have to understand that a lot of the sort of population movement for Puerto Ricans is looking for economic opportunities, right? Here, like in Holyoke, right, in terms of affordable housing, living wages, we're dealing with those things prior to Hurricane Maria. So it's really difficult for some families out here. And we still have some cases, some reports that still families are living in this weekly motels out there where electricity is being cut off, the FEMA help ran out. So basically, it's still an indication that there's a realization that it's not might be as easy as we said, kind of like moving to the Orlando area out here, because there's still some issues that the community has to face out here. And I'm guessing that this is going to be sort of accelerated a little bit more with COVID-19, with the effect it's having on the hospitality industry as well. And it's not necessarily that it's going to mean that a lot of Puerto Ricans are going to go back to the island, but they might go to other places, right? And that might be some of the issues that might be going on as well, some internal movement as well. So you'll see other areas like, we saw the numbers before, there might be an increase in Texas and other areas where there might be some more economic opportunities out here.
Well, thanks, Fernando. We're going to turn now to Sandra, a voice, a very prominent voice from Puerto Rico, to give us her take, from the island to the to stateside population. What are your impressions?
Bueno, Edwin and everyone, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here and to discuss what we have been through in the last few years, not only here in Puerto Rico, but also in the diaspora. So before I get into anything that I like to say, I'd like you to watch a short video that I prepared of everything that we went through over the past 3 years. Let's watch it.
More than salsa, reggaeton, or trap, unfortunately, Puerto Rico is also now associated with despair. We are suffocated by disaster capitalism, and we have no clear idea of how or when we're going to get out of this crisis. We have been on a recession for over a decade. President Obama imposed a financial oversight board of 7 people that were not elected, but are the ones running the economy and making all the decisions. On September 5th, Hurricane Irma affected the east coast of Puerto Rico. Then 2 weeks later came the monster. Hurricane Maria destroyed everything on its path. Devastation was unprecedented, and no one had an exact idea on the death toll. President Trump came to the island and threw paper towel at us. He was criticized, yet we now know that then Governor Ricky Rosselló had been lying. A Harvard University study estimated the death toll on 4,645 people, but no one will ever know for sure, thanks to the resiliency of the people in the island and the diaspora. Then, on the summer of 2019, we, a group of independent journalists, uncovered hundreds of pages of a chat between the governor and his team with homophobic, racist, and vulgar comments that prompted many protests in Puerto Rico and abroad. Rosselló initially refused to leave, but the public pressure mounted, and after 11 days of consecutive massive protests, he finally resigned.
Hoy siento que continuar en esta posición representa una dificultad para que el éxito alcanzado perdure. He tomado la siguiente decisión. Con desprendimiento, hoy les anuncio que estaré renunciando al puesto del gobernador efectivo el viernes 2 de agosto.
But then there was another political crisis. We had 3 governors in a 2-week period. Finally, Wanda Vázquez was sworn in as the new governor of the island. And then the unthinkable, a series of earthquakes affected half of the island, particularly in the south and the west and up in the mountains. Schools were destroyed, houses leveled, many were left homeless. More than 3,000 earthquakes hit in less than a month, and they have continued up to this date with less intensity, but producing the same anxiety on the population.
Nos dio duro esta vez. Nos dio duro.
Es la escuela, no sé cómo se llama, pero ciertamente colapsó, miren. Oh, miren, ahora mismo, esto es en vivo, miren. Oh.
Aquí hay un problema más psicológico de la gente no quiere regresar a sus casas, la gente tiene mucho temor de que sus techos caigan, de que de noche vuelva a temblar fuerte como nos pasó el pasado 7, y es un temor colectivo.
An asteroid fell on the south of the island, and then space garbage from a satellite also came down. We couldn't think of anything worse. Then COVID-19 arrived. We started with a lockdown, but now people have lost control. The statistics are unreal, and we're less than 40 days away from the next election cycle. In short, we do not leave one crisis to enter another. Where are we now?
Where are we now, 3 years after Hurricane Maria? And I have to agree with Edwin stating that disaster capitalism has been the main situation in Puerto Rico, and how all the foreign companies are coming in to go after the monies that are going to be bring to Puerto Rico for rebuilding.
One of the main issues that we're confronting right now is migration, as you mentioned, Edwin, before, related, and that is key to the development of Puerto Rico, because it is related to the chance to improve our economy. There's as you mentioned, and as I have been able to prove within the last few weeks that I have interviewed a couple of people from foreign populations that are increasing in Puerto Rico, particularly Dominicans, and also from the Chinese population. So that has a direct impact of the people that are able to work and stay on the island. So that has to be taken into consideration when we talk about the local population in Puerto Rico. But Puerto Ricans, we always tend to think about us in the island and perhaps in New York, and we have to watch closely what is going on in Florida. That has become the battleground for the political campaign and for the next election. President Trump just launched a new advertising campaign and a specific ad in Spanish language geared towards the Puerto Rican population, and also Biden has done the same. So Puerto Rico has become the new battleground to attract voters between the Democrats and the Republican Party. I think we should use that as an excuse or as an opportunity to bring forward our issues into the mainstream and also into the general American population. So that one of the main issues is that we have to promote the vote of Puerto Ricans living abroad, living in anywhere in the States. So that's very important. And us here on the island, we have to tell our relatives living on the States to go out and vote. We have been hit hard by COVID-19. As we speak, the government is discussing the possibility of going again to what they did last March. So we have to be careful of what we're doing in Puerto Rico and basically see what is going on the States. So how can we decide where to go to at this moment in terms of what would happen after so many years after Hurricane Maria? And I think one of the main topics of discussions is to be focusing on what is the truth versus the fake news mythology and the fake news environment that is being pushed forward, particularly on social media. So we have to be very careful with that. For me, the main focus at this moment will be a couple of questions that I like to ask. Are we gonna be owners or employees? Are we gonna be masters or slaves? Are we gonna let foreign companies and foreign interests come here and rebuild and get all the money? Or are we Puerto Ricans and Puerto Ricans in the diaspora gonna take part in the rebuilding of the island? Another one would be the role of the municipalities. There was an intent and a couple of years ago, even before Hurricane Maria, of eliminating or shutting down some of the municipalities and municipal governments. And those are the ones that remain operating and helping people right after Hurricane Maria and right after the earthquakes. So that position has changed, and we need to know what are going to be the roles of those municipalities from now on, and particularly during the rebuilding. And this, my main question is, why is this not being discussed in the public opinion? I mean, they're focusing on the funds and they're focusing on all the money that FEMA announced last week, but they're not talking about the role of the mayors or the local communities and the local community-based organizations in that rebuilding. And sometimes I think it's like una encerrona. They're trying to basically, deceive the Puerto Rican population. We have to be very careful because of that. People are tired, suffocated with so many crises, one right after the other: hurricanes, earthquakes, pandemic, politics, corruption cases. The level of despair and violence has been increasing, and also the mental health situation is in crisis, particularly in terms of violence. I'm really concerned of the fact that there have been many women being killed there. So far, until September 19, there have been 28 feminicides. 10 of those women have been killed by their husbands. Also violence against the elders and against the children. So we need to take that into consideration because mental health is a situation that needs to be addressed even within the rebuilding plans because we need to deal with that. And also, el boricua es impaciente. You know, Puerto Ricans, they don't have any patience. And there's no such thing as a JetBlue revolution, at least at this moment. Because in the past, when there was a need to go away and to get a job, you will just jump into a plane and go to Florida, go to New York, or go to Connecticut. Right now, it's not that easy because in the States, there's going on the COVID-19 is going on. Unemployment rates are going high in certain areas, particularly in Florida. So there's no option at this moment for many Puerto Ricans to go away. And 3 years after Maria, if you're gonna ask me what would be the three main priorities in terms of focusing for the future, I will say improve the infrastructure. So that will be not only buildings and roads, the general infrastructure has been destroyed. Roads, electricity, telecommunications is still off in some areas, and housing, and that stops the economic development of the island. The second would be save the education system. The different administrations have destroyed the education system in Puerto Rico. Sometimes I think they want to make un pueblo bruto. They want to make us dumb, and the way to do it is they made us dumb, uneducated, and people, they think that we are not going to be able to make wise decisions. So that's why education is key for anything that we want to do in the future. School closings did not bring savings, but expenses. Virtual education with this pandemic has been a chaos. It has been chaotic. It's not working at all. Most students have not received their computers. And also, this is very important, dropouts have increased since the pandemic. This semester alone, over 1,300 students have not returned to the public school system, according to the Secretary of Education in Puerto Rico. So where are those students now? They're not going away to the States, so that means that they're probably not studying at all, because they might not have a telephone or a computer, and they might not have access to technology. So that the 1,300 students, that's a lot. And that says something on what's going on. And also the University of Puerto Rico, I mean, it has to be addressed the destruction within the system. The third topic would be serving the most vulnerable populations. And for me, those are the elders. And because of the pandemic, a lot of old people are dying. Also, the people with disabilities that tend to be related to poverty. Poverty levels and disabilities are associated. And also, other than children, people with disabilities, and the elders. Those are the most vulnerable populations. And I think those are the main focus that we have to address in thinking of any possibilities of going forward in terms of the development of Puerto Rico. So those are my main ideas so far, and I do appreciate the invitation.
Thank you so much, Sandra. So one of the most interesting questions related to what you were presenting is that accountability and the whole question of corruption in Puerto Rico is an issue. So what are your thoughts on, all this sort of, we want to help, we want to put pressure, but at the same time, the transparency, you mentioned the governor situation last summer. What are your thoughts on this issue of accountability, transparency, and good government?
That's one of the main roadblocks in any development in Puerto Rico. Corruption is in every aspect of the political arena and also in government. So one thing I like to ask is, we have to wait until the election cycle. Once that happens and the new government gets into place, that will be an option. But the second one, I think, is the diaspora needs to be more active in terms of pressuring the federal government into investigating what the corruption cases in Puerto Rico. and go after all the allegations that are of mismanagement that are taking place right now, because they tend to be very slow in terms of their actions. And I will have to add that particularly this government has been very the lack of transparency in this government has been really out there. We, as a journalist, we have been forced to sue the government in order to get information, basic information that is public document. So imagine all the other aspects. So I do agree that that's one of the main concerns that people have.
Well, there are a lot of questions that I gotta go and read before I can, distribute them among you. But let me just go through a list, mentioning some of the people that can address them, and then I will go a first round for you to respond to that. So let me just make some general questions to you. I have my own list of questions that I will briefly address after I do the round of questions. So one question, I guess Carlos could be one that answers this, or maybe, well, Jennifer will take the next question, which is that Puerto Rico is seeing other than Puerto Ricans moving to Puerto Rico, right? From Latin America, from the United States, non-Puerto Rican from the United States. So if you have some comments about that, what data have you seen and how significant that is? And in some areas, Rincon, obviously, but now Cabo Rojo and, all the Airbnbs and all what can you say about gentrification and how that impacts the population? We're losing population on the one hand, and then we're replacing population. So if you have some thoughts about that. We also have a question about the brain drain. Maybe Jennifer, you can answer that question. In the post-Maria, do you have data that suggests that we're losing the most educated and that we're getting back whom, right? So talk about a little bit of the brain drain issue, whether it's present or not. And then I have a couple of questions for Fernando. I already asked you, I think the Orlando population thing. There's one here about the climate change and whether, do we have like a network that understands climate change and how can we respond to this phenomenon that is going to continue, right? Because we're just starting this sort of, new historical phase of climate change that, as you mentioned, affects all the coast down there in the United States, but it's also going to affect the Caribbean and Puerto Rico specifically, right? There's another question, I don't know if who can take it, about comparing recent migration to what happened after San Ciriaco. Personally, I think the conditions are very different. And San Ciriaco was 1899, and the means of transportation, everything else, devastated the island. There were other problems, and anyway. But if someone has some comments on that, I'm not an expert in that period. Let me see what else is pending here. I think there, okay. There are some questions I will say that are very specific. My email is email@hunter.cuny.edu. And if I didn't respond to them today, please email me. I will take notes of this. I will transcribe this and see if I can get back to you. But if I don't have your email, I won't be able to respond. I will try to do my best to identify your email with your name and your question. But if I'm unable to do that, please send me a note. It's a question about the health status of the elderly in Puerto Rico and in the diaspora, what's happening with that segment of the population. It's another question on asthma and migration. It's related to social services. So I don't know if Fernando, in the book that you edited, there were some papers about the whole role of health for people to migrate, right? There's anecdotal data that people are going back to Puerto Rico because medical services are cheaper there. Another data that I heard was that because Florida, the bulk of our population migrating there is a non-Medicaid expansion state, and in Puerto Rico has Medicaid, that some people that were affected by the pandemic and other illnesses are going back. So maybe you have some information that you can share on that. There's someone that wants contacts with farmers and other people that want to contribute, buy land and go back to Puerto Rico. Write me as individuals, and I will put you in contact with the people that, our network down there that can help with that. Let me see if I have, obviously there are some political questions, maybe more political questions, I will say, that maybe Sandra can help with the whole question of the role of the status. I didn't see her listing that in the priorities. So what's going on? If the status is so important, why is not an immediate concern that you put out there, especially when you have two competing bills in Congress, one from the senator, the congressman from Florida, Darren Soto, and one co-signed by Ocasio-Cortez and Nidia Velázquez. So maybe you can comment on that, or so you have a little chance to prepare your answers before we go around. From my end, there is a question about FEMA funds and whether they're going to be released. FEMA, as you saw, spent already the bulk of funding that was earmarked for Puerto Rico. Okay, there is some residual funding, but the way FEMA funds disaster recovery is different from the CDGDR and the CDGR mitigation and other forms of funding. Okay, FEMA has an ongoing program, right, that doesn't have to be earmarked. It's appropriations that are regular every year, and what localities have to do is submit proposals that will be, in this case, channeled from Core 3 to FEMA. FEMA will assign technical experts to evaluate those proposals, and then those proposals will be funded, not necessarily based on competition, but based on the needs, right? That's what's called mitigation, and it's called long-term recovery. Some of those funds already went out. Someone asked the program 428, but in any case, we are planning to do something in this area. There were a bunch of questions about this that is related to the recovery in Puerto Rico and the capacity of the civic sector to participate, right? For example, all this stuff about the reconstruction of the grid, it's a big topic, but we're not clear of how that funding is gonna, is it gonna support alternative energy? And there are too many questions. How is it going to affect the last mile, people that are isolated, that were, presumably were going to be receiving solar energy because they are not well connected to the grid, and so forth. So it's a conversation that is forthcoming. We have a special issue, the Centro journal, that is almost ready to go out. We're in the final stages of, peer review and so forth. So we will do a webinar once we have those papers ready. So we will bring the experts to address these issues. The other question, I mentioned the job skills of return migration. So Jennifer, I think that's going to go to you. There's a question that maybe Sandra can expand on that too, about the recovery at the municipal level, because the migration has affected all, more localities more than others, right? We've done quite a bit of work with architects and other people that do urban planning around various municipalities. And the reality is that the municipalities have been weakened so much by all these events, right? And the law that was supposed to infuse some more autonomy has been weakened as well. So what you have is sort of a local capacity, both in the nonprofit sector and at the municipal level, that has been weakened over time, right? For example, when you look at the nonprofit sector that participates in CDGDR funding, you have probably 10 or 12 organizations that can actually rehab and build housing. And only one or two of them actually have ongoing construction projects, right? If you look back at the Arab money that I suggested, they built thousands of units in a couple of years. So it's not that we can do it. It's just that the incorporation of that sector in the recovery process has been lacking. Okay, hopefully that will change. But my point is that all this question about CDBGR funding, what the differences between mitigation and recovery funding and all that, we will address in a webinar. It's a long conversation. I don't want to, go on about this right now, but it's a very important topic. There's one more question about the climate, the plans to adapt to the climate, upcoming climate crisis, right? Growing climate crisis in Puerto Rico. All of that has to do with local planning, right? Mitigation and community strengthening cannot happen unless you have a very purposely deliberate process of planning at the local level. Planning that involves not just mitigation for disaster, but planning that involves economic development, resiliency, and so on and so forth. That topic is part of what we're going to address in our next webinar. So I'm going to stop there. And I'm going to call now, I guess, let me go to the order they presented. So Jennifer, I will give you the chance to respond to the questions that I fielded. And while you speak, I'm going to try keep it short, 1 minute or so, in answering each of the aspects that I asked you. And in the meantime, I'm going to not pay too much attention because I read the next questions for the next round. But please, keep it tight, and I'll try to, direct traffic here the best way I can. So Jennifer.
Okay, so I believe the first question was related to the brain drain. We pushed out a report, I believe it was it was in 2016, and what we did use was looked at 2006 and 2015 migration of Puerto Ricans leaving the island and relocating here. And what we did was we compared the occupations of the migrants that left Puerto Rico and compared them to the Puerto Ricans who stayed in Puerto Rico. So some of the interesting findings that we did see was that within the occupations, we did see some of those that had STEM type jobs. They showed STEM jobs were the ones that left Puerto Rico relative to those that stayed behind. And then we did see also within the lower sector, low wage jobs such as production, material moving, food and building and grounds cleaning, they also were represented higher within the migrants that left between the 2006 and 2015 period. So we did see it a little bit of both. Whether there's a true brain drain is a question that we're trying to figure out with the data. But we hope to update this report using the 2006 and to 2019 data. So how do you compare that with post-Hurricane Maria? Well, post-Hurricane Maria, everyone left. There was not one particular people with certain type of occupation or age. It was just everyone had left during post-Hurricane Maria. And I'm not too sure what was the next question.
Yeah, I think that was the main question, whether you saw some, selectivity in terms of the migrants. So I guess Carlos, I think you have your question. So why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, you only gave me 5. I'll just respond to a couple. So number one, in terms of best practices, whether what we highlighted in the report is replicable. Well, that is the intent. The intent, this study came about as a result of an application that the city of Holyoke made to the Massachusetts Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program in order for them to prepare for climate change driven events. So they were hoping, and they're still hoping, to be able to collect this information and adapt their findings so that they can be prepared for this type of event and any other type of event, because, anecdotally, my co-author, Charles Venator Santiago from El Instituto, has heard that many of the learnings that came out of this report have actually been influential in providing responses to the pandemic. Creating this one-stop shop approach to responding to a crisis, where you can have a hub of services. Under this particular pandemic, however, that can also be somewhat difficult because you don't want to congregate a lot of people in one geographical space, in keeping with social distancing. But the point is that, yes, we do hope and we believe that many of the findings of this study and the response that the City of Holyoke and its civic sector and governmental sector is replicable. In terms of the replacing of the population, as Jennifer has indicated in the reports that she has produced, there has been a steady erosion of the population in Puerto Rico since 2004, since just before the beginning of the economic crisis, coinciding with the economic crisis that, as we know, started in Puerto Rico in 2006. So from 2005 on, there has been a decline of the population in Puerto Rico. One thing that we did notice as a result of the 2019 American Community Survey one-year estimate results is that, yes, the Puerto Rican population, the population in Puerto Rico decreased by 1,400 people. There was a decrease in the population. However, the Puerto Rican population in Puerto Rico decreased by 25,000 people. So there is a difference of about 23,000 people that are non-Puerto Ricans who are on the island, who were not here before. So in response to the interviews that Sandra was mentioning, she has conducted recently, I suspect this is something that we need to do a little bit more research on, that there may be a response to Ley 20, Ley 22, that the government of Puerto Rico, the Commonwealth government created to try to incentivize the immigration to the island. Well, there might be an opportunity for people who are bringing in capital to settle in Puerto Rico and take advantage of the tax exemptions that the government of Puerto Rico and the U.S. federal government might provide. So is there a replacing of the population? Well, it's a little bit too soon to tell, but there is one indicator that suggests that may be taking place. But we must remember something. 95% of the population of Puerto Rico is Puerto Rican. And 92% of the population of Puerto Rico is Puerto Ricans born in Puerto Rico. So, let's not go overboard and think that, Puerto Ricans are being replaced willy-nilly, because the overwhelming majority, 9 persons out of 10 in Puerto Rico, are Puerto Ricans born on the island, okay? And so I have a couple of other answers, but I want to give a chance to both Sandra and Fernando to provide answers themselves.
Fernando?
Yeah, so there was I think there was a question, Sandra, you're still there, Sandra Stern, about whether there's a Puerto Rico climate migration policy consortium. I'm not aware if there's one. I'm not aware of, but anybody can tell me in the panelists out here. Edwin, you asked me about climate change organizations. There's a lot of organizations dealing with these issues. In Puerto Rico, if you don't know, you can follow the work of Marisa Barreto at the University of Puerto Rico at the Planning School that is looking at sea level rise and coastal erosion. Conciencia Puerto Rico is another group that is looking at kind of like these issues of climate health. So that is happening in Puerto Rico. For my part, I'm affiliated more on the disaster side of it. So the Research Hub is part of the North American Alliance of Hazards and Disaster Institutes. I'm going to do a presentation later on with the National Adaptation Forum at the University of Central Florida. We have also an Urban Resiliency Initiative The city of Orlando does have a resiliency office that looks at sustainability, climate change, and all sort of things. And that's becoming more common in some cities, basically to have resiliency office looking at these issues of climate change. Edwin, you also asked me about the elderly and health services. I have briefly touched upon some of that research, but we know, I mean, if we look at the demographics in Puerto Rico, we have a percentage of elderly population that needs help out there. I mean, in terms of research, in terms of health services, I'm not aware of, concrete specific studies that have looked at that, but I'm always wondering, in terms of the transnational sort of, if we can call it type of services, right? And we've heard a lot of anecdotal sort of stories that people come here for 6 months and then they go back to their doctors and they get the treatment that they like and they go back and forward in terms of that. That's something that I'm proposing to do in the future. So again, I'll keep you posted if we are able to get funding to do that type of research. So I think those were the questions that were for me. So Sandra,
and the Centro newsletter will be happy to disseminate this as you produce that, right? So Sandra, it's your turn. I have more questions for all of you. I mean, a few more, but let Sandra take a crack at this.
Okay, before I answer the questions, I'd like to add that a couple of weeks ago, as I mentioned on the presentation, I interviewed a demographer and several members of the foreign populations in Puerto Rico. And according to Encuesta de la Comunidad, in 2018, there were about 161,000 people living on the island that were born on the U.S. And most of them came through the laws 20 and 22, according to them. So you're right, Carlos, in that assessment. In terms of people that were not Americans, mainly from Latin America, in particularly Dominican Republic, Cuba, and then Venezuela. And now Venezuela is like the second country that they're coming from. There are about 85,000 in 2018. And the new study just came out, I think this week, or at the end of last week. So I don't have the current statistics on that one. In terms of the status, the question that was posed on the role of the status, I must say that when you're under stress and you're under an emergency for many years, the status is not the main issue for the majority of the people in Puerto Rico. When you ask them if they go into their ideology, political ideology, that's when they will start asking the questions. But the fact that there's as I mentioned, Florida has become a battleground for Democrats and Republicans. And you can tell that both Biden and Trump, both campaigns are using Puerto Rico in terms of promoting their agendas. So they're using the status situation, and the New Progressive Party, the governor, also included the question on this for this election, whether we want to be state or not. But there's an internal campaign of people claiming that they don't want to vote for a no, because that's not the main issue. So, and also, other than the bills by Nidia Velázquez and AOC, and the other one by Darren Soto, there are some decisions pending at the Supreme Court as well. So we need to look into that. But if you ask anyone on the street, that won't be the main situation. People are more concerned about getting jobs, the fact that there's not an economy. There's a lot of the situation with the poverty levels in Puerto Rico has been on the rising. That's why you see people making those long lines and getting money from the CARES Act and waiting for and there has been some cases related to that, and people that are misusing the funds because they don't have the money. I mean, there's an issue with education. So if you ask if you go to the street and ask the people, that wouldn't be the first question that they would answer. Status would not be the main priority. They just want to survive and be able to live after so many crises, one after the other. And then the other question was regarding the recovery at the municipal level. Just today, the mayor of Guanica was really upset with the local state legislators saying that they left him alone in rebuilding and destroying what was left, the buildings and houses that were destroyed during the earthquakes. So there's a sense of neglect and isolation from some of those mayors. And even though some other mayors have helped them, like just to give you an example, the mayor of Bayamón have come to the south to assist some of the other mayors. The mayor of San Juan, who just lost the primary in the Popular Democratic Party, also went to help crossing party lines among mayors that were helping each other, but still it's not enough. So I don't see a recovery at this moment. I don't see a particular infrastructure in knowing how to assess those fundings. So one of the questions that I made during the presentation, Edwin, and I'm sure you can answer this better than me, is I mentioned if we're going to be owners or are we going to be employees, slaves or masters? And it tends to, and I do feel that most of the decisions are going to be made by companies that are not from the island and not even from the diaspora. So what's going on within us, the Puerto Ricans, not only on the island, but also on the States? What are any Puerto Rican companies coming here and helping us and making money also in the process? So I think we should work towards that arena. I don't see a big movement towards that. In terms of companies, I do see it in terms of community-based organizations, the assistance and working together, but not in terms of business so far.
There is actually one U.S.-based Puerto Rican-led organization that is building housing in Puerto Rico. There's one.
Yeah, only one.
Yeah, Acacia Network.
Acacia, sí.
Yeah, built 100 plus units in Dorado, and now he's doing a couple hundred in Caguas, right? But that's an exception, right? All the other contracts that went to U.S.-based companies went to privately owned, and anyway. But let me leave that conversation aside, because when we do the next webinar that we'll focus on that, we'll dissect it a little bit better. It's something that we're looking into it, putting some numbers. Let me we have 8 minutes to go, but so I'm going to give you 1 more minute to wrap it up. There are a couple of questions that you can address if you have time, very briefly. And so for Sandra, a little bit of follow-up of what you were presenting. But let me start with Jennifer, because there's one question about the schools, right? And the school closing and what can be done. And you wrote a brief on that, looking at school closing and alternatives, right? The policies that can be implemented. So you may want to answer that. And then for Sandra, the whole question of the role of the diaspora, looking at us from Puerto Rico, what do you think the diaspora can do? The networks that we work on, and another question was about the conditions of women, that people thought that was important, and is there an agenda that can be done for that? Then for Fernando and Carlos, there was a question about the cross-racial coalitions with Latinos and other groups. It's a political question. How can we get them involved in solidarity with Puerto Rico and in stateside networks and what have you? I think there was, there were too many questions. I'm sure I'm going to miss some people, and I apologize for that. But let me. There were some more. Anyway, let me stop there because we don't have that much time, and it's a little bit of a mess. My handwriting right now is there were too many things to do. I will say though, in one of the questions that bounced back to me about this question that actually we were discussing last week with some Florida folks, that has to do with the political proposal for Puerto Rico, right? Both Biden and President Trump have these proposals. And if you look at the Biden proposal, the question is about the pharma industry in Puerto Rico and whether the Trump plan is feasible, right? That's the question. And my answer is that, you know, the Biden plan is almost a mirror image of the recommendation from the bipartisan commission that was created as part of PROMESA, that was so-called the Task Force for Economic Development in Puerto Rico, right? Nidia Velázquez was there, was co-chaired by a Republican, and so forth, right? That was a bipartisan coalition. And they made, you know, EITC, Medicaid permanency, and a bunch of other, you know, interagency coordination in the states. And Biden proposed all that. What he's proposing, I didn't see anything that was particularly new in the, you know, obviously it's an agenda that a lot of people support. I support the points, but the issue is when you compare that to Trump's proposal about the pharma, you know, where do you stand on that? And my point is, hey, the bipartisan commission was about alleviating poverty and sort of a ground floor for the need, the assistance that Puerto Rico needs. The Trump issue goes to restoring the pharma industry, which is something that a lot of people in Puerto Rico, related or not to the pharma industry, are for, and it's a big issue. So my point to all my friends is we need both, okay? And one doesn't exclude the other, and they're both complementary. And besides that, Puerto Rico needs a reconstruction program that goes beyond the articulation of all these plans together to get us out of the hole that I just described at the beginning. So let me stop there because, you know, I took more of my share of time in answering this, anyway. So let's go to Jennifer and then we'll wrap it up. We have 5 minutes. I'm sorry for that. Jennifer, you're muted. It's a great point, but we gotta hear it.
So we released a report related to the discussion with the school closures, and I think one of the recommendations that we proposed in the brief was to create a multi-purpose community centers to these closed school buildings. But since we had the earthquake, so that's kind of difficult to sort of do that. But I think one of the proposals that we've had was that to create services to the elderly and disability folks in some of these communities where they're experiencing deep depopulation. So for example, just to create services for these for the elderly community, especially in the rural areas, to serve as emergency facilities. So those were one of the things that we had proposed. And in regards to the school enrollment, it is declining. We received some statistical numbers from the Department of Education that we hope to release in an upcoming research brief. For example, 1 year later after Hurricane Maria, student enrollment was 307,000, and now it's at 277,000. So that has decreased. So it might go back to what Sandra was saying with the dropouts, right? Students relocating. So that has a major effect in these communities where not only are they experiencing school closures, but they're also experiencing the out-migration of these school-age children with their families that are leaving these municipalities. So I'll wrap that up. Thank you.
I will say in regards to your questions about cross-racial coalitions, Edwin, that certainly at the elite level and at the governmental level, there was a strong response from non-Puerto Ricans to the destruction in Puerto Rico at the state level, at the local levels, in New York City, in New York State, in the state of Massachusetts, in the state of Connecticut and New Jersey and Florida, and I'll let Fernando speak to that if he wants to. There was an immediate, almost automatic reflexive response. And I think that comes from the fact that Puerto Ricans represent important segments of the population and of the electorate in those states. So more than a solidarity-like affinity and response that they may have come from these political elites, which I think that there was also the calculated effort that comes from building a political power base among Puerto Ricans in these states, in these cities, in these towns, that then resulted in perhaps more attention from governmental authorities more broadly. In states where you have fewer Puerto Ricans with less arraigo, with less roots in the community and perhaps political weight, there was not so much of a response, I would say. Certainly within the non-for-profit sector in Holyoke and in surrounding communities, there was a lot of solidarity, but because these are social sectors that were already interacting with each other and they knew each other. And so it was an easy transition, well, not an easy transition, but it was an easier transition to make. In regards to a previous question you had made about the motivations to go back to Port.
We're gonna have to give 1 minute to
yes, go ahead.
My apologies. We're running out of time, and we have one last slide to for the next one. So my apologies. Fernando and Sandra, you're already gone. My apologies for that.
I know. So real quick, so Carlos, like Carlos mentioned, we saw some of that cross collaboration here in Florida as well. I think the realization that it's becoming a political power, people want to be part of that community and response in times of need. I think my issue is the issue of sustainability, right? And now we have other groups as well. We have a lot of Venezuelans coming in. We have a lot of Colombians and other groups. How can we integrate those? And for some reason, it seems that at least the press coverage is sort of kind of like dividing the issues, but I think we can find those common issues out here and sort of establish that cross collaboration. So thank you, everybody.
I may just add that in terms of how the diaspora can help, just keep the pressure on the media. Write columns, go to op-ed and the TV and keep Puerto Rico on the national agenda in terms of public opinion. That would be important for us once the issue remains on the U.S. media. So that would be great for us.
Thank you so much. I like to thank the audience for their participation. Thank you to everybody, and advise that you can go to our website and download all the presentations that we made. They're edited, as you saw. The videos will be edited. The documents will be there, and it will be our pleasure to respond to any email inquiry about the presentations. We also appreciate if you can take a few minutes to answer a survey about the webinar, what you like to see next time, and all that to say that this webinar will not be possible without your input, your participation, and thank you so much for joining us. Hasta la próxima. Nos vemos.